Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Is that all right? The mic. It's really wonderful to be here at the Palestine Center. The Palestine Center consistently does, I think, some of this town's best events, and I know I've benefited tremendously from the content that the Palestine Center creates, most notably the recent transcript of Samer's talk last week. So I want to thank the organizers, both for inviting me today, but then also for all the work that the Palestine Center does. In giving this talk today, I'm really privileged to speak to such an esteemed group, especially old friends like Will and others. So this is going to be a tag team effort. So if there are some questions that I feel like others might be able to respond to better, then I might turn to people like Will and others. But in terms of this talk, I wanted to, the title Gaza Humanitarian Implosion is actually from an Amnesty report that I'm going to heavily talk about that was published in March of 2008, and then I'll fast forward to the conflict. So first of all, there's as with so many issues relating to Israel and Palestine, I think we have to start with how the issue is being framed. And we see that very much today in terms of how this issue is being spoken about. It's oftentimes referred to as a war between Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Hamas. And I think that's really a misnomer. I think what we're witnessing today is an assault, is a massacre. And I think that a war implies that there are some sort of two consensual factions fighting with some sort of equal military power. I don't see that whatsoever. And I think that when we're going through and when we're hearing people speak about it, I think we should correct them when it is referred to as a war. It is not a war whatsoever. It is an assault. It is a massacre. Another issue too is that the conflict is oftentimes given a start date. When I refer to the violence that started on December 27th, I would say the violence escalated on December 27th. But to me, the Israeli assault predates December 27th. To me, I think the Israeli assault includes the blockade. It includes the other attacks as well, too. So when I refer to the violence on December 27th, I refer to it as the escalation of violence. But to me, that's not a start date whatsoever. And there's a lot of efforts to, I think, obviously there's value in talking about the period from the 27th to the present. But to me, we have to look at a much broader picture. Another issue, too, is that it's often taken out of its historical and political context. And this is something that, to be honest, as a human rights organization, we're not exactly in the best position to comment about this. For example, we don't talk about so much the occupation, what happened in 48, what happened in 67. And so I think our voice as a human rights organization has value, but I think it has increased value when our voice is added with historians and others. There's a whole group of new sort of post-Zionist historians. Avi Shalaim did a great piece in The Guardian where they talk about the occupation, where they talk about the history of Israel's colonial operations in Gaza and other places. And so I think that our voice is good in terms of talking about the human rights violations and the humanitarian issue, but it should be supplemented by looking at the historical issues and also the power dynamics as well, too. There's obviously power issues here as well, both in terms of Israel's military might, but also its might in terms of, in the corridors of Washington, D.C. And then there's an issue about sides blamed, and the other one is the idea of creating balance. I'm oftentimes, even yesterday I gave a presentation where somebody said that I was not balanced on the conflict, and I said I have no desire to be balanced on this conflict. The conflict is tremendously lopsided. So for example, if I'm giving a 50-minute presentation, it would be foolish if I talked for 25 minutes on violations by Hamas and 25 minutes violations by Israel. That just doesn't make any sense. We are concerned about violations by Hamas, but we also have to look at that this is a lopsided conflict. And so to me, the issue isn't about being balanced, it's about being consistent, and it's about being fair. We're applying the same international laws to all parties to the conflict. But it really isn't about being balanced, and I think there's another term as well about being objective. I don't pretend to be objective on this conflict. I don't think it's possible to read the accounts about what's happening and say that one is objective. I think it's really important to be consistent. So that's what I'll try to do in this presentation. Okay, I want to do three things in this presentation, and then we'll open up for discussion and Q&A. The first is the roots of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The second, the escalation of violence that began on the 27th and continues, unfortunately, till today. And the last is what Amnesty has done and what you can do. So now Amnesty published a report in March of 2008 called Gaza, a Humanitarian Implosion. It was authored with Oxfam and CARE and about a dozen other organizations based in Europe. And there's some interesting statistics from that report. And part of the reason why I wanted to go over, and I know this might be basic for others, is that when I'm usually interviewed on the radio and people say, what's happening right now in Gaza? I say, well, let's look at what was said about Gaza before the 27th of December. Let's look at the conditions then. Because what's really shocking and appalling about the current Israeli assault is that what we're witnessing is the Israeli attack on a population that had already been beaten down, that had already been deprived of so many basic necessities. And this is something that we tried to capture in a report, just some statistics that I find to be helpful when I'm giving talks or interviews on this. So we know that there was a blockade implemented after Hamas was democratically elected. And if you look just in the first statistic, and this is just a very short period of time, so I imagine if there were statistics, and I couldn't find them, on a wider period of time, the food prices would have increased. But just in that 1 month period, we look at the price of milk rose 20% in that 1 month period alone. Another issue, too, is that prior to the blockade, there were around 250 trucks carrying aid that entered Gaza each day. And in Samer's talk here, he actually gave a good section where he spoke about how even that number of 250 is just a small sum for a population of 1.5 million. But nonetheless, before the blockade, there were about 250 trucks carrying aid into Gaza. Subsequent blockades by the Israeli government, which I'll get to later, what the UN called it, had severely limited how much aid could enter into Gaza. And by December, before the violence escalated, that number had dropped to just 5, around an average of 5. And then, of course, we know about a very infamous incident in December where a shipload of Libyan aid, 3,000 tons, was prevented from entering into Gaza. Now, poverty. In 2006, 63% were living in absolute poverty. In 2008, that number had jumped to 80%. This I thought was an interesting statistic. In 2004, households were spending 37% of their income on food, and 62% of their income was spent on food in 2007. And then there's the number of families that are dependent on food aid has reached 3/4 by the time that we published a report in March of 2008. Unemployment continues to be a severe issue. It's now, at least when the report was issued, around 40%. Palestinians are unable to go into Israel for cheap labor, and also many factories have been shut down as well too. Something that we see, this last slide, but very much affecting what's happening today, medical facilities were operating with very limited capacities as of March of 2008, with electricity for only 8 to 10 hours a day. Amnesty had many cases in 2008 where we said they were wounded Palestinians who desperately needed to get out of Gaza, who desperately needed medical attention, and we tried, unfortunately, in most cases unsuccessfully, to get them out. Many of them died. Just recently, a pregnant mother in late November died because she wasn't able to get adequate medical treatment. And again, this is all before the violence had escalated. Now, let's look at what was said before the violence escalated about the conditions in Gaza. Because again, I think there's this idea, particularly in a lot of American newspapers, to present Gaza as this place that all of a sudden just erupted into this chaos. And how did things get so bad all of a sudden? But unfortunately, we have such a short-term memory that we don't talk about what was said about Gaza just a few months before the conflict escalated. So this is John Ging, who said that it is a disaster, speaking about Gaza, it is a disaster for everybody because it's touching everybody in every aspect of their life. The way things have been reduced here, there's a very subhuman existence for the general population. The definitions of a humanitarian crisis are rather obscene when compared with just how people are having to struggle to survive here at the moment. Now, Richard Falk, who's one of the most demonized persons in the U.S., but nonetheless, I think his comments are useful, maybe perhaps because he's being demonized so much. He came out with a very strong statement where he used some important legal terms that I'll get to later on in the presentation when we talk about crimes against humanity or collective punishment. What's happening in Gaza before the 27th was collective punishment. Before the 27th was a crime against humanity. And here's a really good quote by Richard Falk in a statement that he made. Most of these I've taken from The Guardian, which I think, in addition to other news outlets, has been doing some wonderful coverage. He says,